The heat in Oak Creek County Courthouse had become its own kind of punishment. 3 days without air conditioning, and the building had turned into a slow cooker, the kind of heat that made your collar stick to your neck and your thoughts move like molasses. The ceiling fans turned lazy circles overhead, pushing around air that smelled like stale coffee and resignation. Like every person who had ever walked through those doors had left a piece of their defeat behind. Julian Banks sat at the defense table in a suit that had belonged to his uncle. The jacket was a full size too large, the sleeves swallowing his hands, and he kept tugging at the right cuff like he could pull himself together one thread at a time. He was 17 years old, an honor student with a 3.8 GPA. A kid whose biggest previous offense was a library book returned 2 weeks late. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, but anyone looking closely could see the tremor moving through his fingers, the slight shaking that he could not stop no matter how hard he pressed his palms together. His grandmother, Constance Banks, sat in the first row of the gallery. She was 71 years old and had never once in her life looked small. She had raised 4 children in the house on Meridian Street, had planted a garden that the whole neighborhood came to in summer, had outlasted 2 husbands, a factory closure, and a flood. But today she looked like she was holding herself together through sheer will alone, her church hat sitting perfectly on her head, her hands wrapped around the small Bible in her lap, her lips moving in something silent and continuous. The courtroom was half full. A few local reporters, some neighbors who had come to show support, a couple of lawyers waiting for their own cases, killing time. And at the prosecution table, leaning back in his chair with the comfort of a man who had never lost a night's sleep over anything he had ever done, sat Officer Derek Vance. Vance was the kind of man who had grown into his authority like a tree grows into a fence, incorporating it, becoming indistinguishable from it. He was thick through the neck and shoulders with small eyes set deep under a heavy brow, and he chewed a toothpick with the slow, rhythmic patience of someone who had all the time in the world because the world had always moved the way he wanted it to. His uniform was pressed. His boots were shined. He looked like a man who had told this particular story many times before and expected this telling to go exactly like all the others. The defense attorney, a young public defender named Marcus Webb, was doing his best. He was 2 years out of law school and still carried the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting battles in courtrooms where the outcome is often decided before anyone sits down. He had filed 3 motions in the past week. All 3 had been denied by the Honorable Judge Reginald Park, a man who had been on the bench for 22 years, and who had, in those 22 years, developed an almost supernatural ability to look directly at injustice and see nothing remarkable about it. Judge Park sat behind his bench like a man carved from the same wood as the furniture. He had a thin face and wire-rimmed glasses and the permanent expression of someone enduring a minor inconvenience. He had not once made direct eye contact with Julian Banks since the proceedings began. The prosecutor, a woman named Sandra Holt, stood at her podium and looked at her notes, though she clearly did not need them. "Officer Vance," she said, "can you describe in your own words what occurred on the night of September 14th on the corner of Elm and Prospect?" Vance leaned forward slightly, as if settling into a familiar chair. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was flat and practiced, the voice of a man delivering a rehearsed script with just enough variation to sound spontaneous. "I was conducting a routine traffic stop on a vehicle with a broken taillight. The vehicle was registered to one Constance Banks. The driver was identified as Julian Banks, 17, her grandson. And what happened during that stop? I approached the vehicle, identified myself, asked for license and registration, at which point the subject became agitated and began reaching toward the center console area of the vehicle in a manner that I perceived as threatening." "You perceived it as threatening. Can you describe why?" "In my 15 years of experience in law enforcement," Vance said, touching the word experience like it was a trophy, "when a subject reaches suddenly toward a hidden area of a vehicle, that is a recognized threat indicator. I have been trained to respond to that kind of movement. My safety and the safety of the public are the priority in any traffic stop. And what did you observe when you investigated the center console area?" "A small plastic bag containing a white powder substance, subsequently confirmed by lab analysis to be cocaine." The word landed in the courtroom like something dropped from a height. Constance Banks closed her eyes. Julian's hands went still on the table. Marcus Webb rose to cross-examine with the careful energy of a man navigating a minefield. Officer Vance, you stated that my client was reaching toward the center console. Is that correct? That is correct. And this reaching movement, was it fast? Slow? Describe it for the court. It was sudden. Deliberate. Deliberate. Webb paused. Officer Vance, are you aware that my client is left-handed? A very small pause, almost imperceptible. I wasn't aware of that, no. The center console of the vehicle is on the right side. Is that correct? Generally speaking. So a left-handed person reaching for their phone, which was located in their left jacket pocket, would have no reason to reach toward the right side center console. Would you agree with that? I can only testify to what I observed. What you observed? Yes. Webb turned a page in his notes. Officer Vance, did you at any point activate your body camera during the stop? The camera experienced a technical malfunction. A technical malfunction on the night that you found evidence that would result in a felony charge against a 17-year-old honors student. Is that correct? Equipment fails. That's a reality of the job. And the dash cam on your patrol vehicle, also experiencing issues at that time. Both cameras. Both malfunctioning on the same night. Coincidences happen, Counselor. Judge Park's voice came from the bench, thin and sharp. Mr. Webb, I'll remind you to confine your questions to questions. Webb looked at the judge for a moment. Then he nodded slowly and turned back to Vance. One more question, officer. What was my client reaching for in your ultimate determination? The cocaine. But he told you it was his phone. That he was reaching for his phone. That's what he claimed, yes. And his phone, where was it found? A pause. It was in his left jacket pocket. Exactly where he said it was. That's correct. Nothing further. Prosecutor Holt did a brief redirect, establishing Vance's experience and commendations, and then she sat down with a satisfied expression of someone watching a machine do exactly what it was built to do. Judge Park peered over his glasses at the defense table. Mr. Webb, does the defense wish to call any witnesses? Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Julian Banks. Julian stood up. He straightened the oversized jacket as best he could, and walked to the witness stand with the careful dignity of someone who had been told by everyone they loved to hold their head up no matter what happened. He sat down. He looked at the jury. 8 people who had been looking at him with expressions ranging from pity to suspicion for the past 2 days. He looked at his grandmother in the front row. She gave him a small, slow nod. Marcus Webb walked him through the night gently. Julian's voice was steady. He described driving home from his study group, the flash of the lights in his rearview mirror. Pulling over without question because his grandmother had told him his whole life what to do in that situation. Keeping his hands visible, speaking clearly and politely. Reaching for his phone because he had been told he had the right to record any interaction with law enforcement. And then Vance's hand coming through the window and the door being yanked open and everything moving very fast. Did you have any cocaine in that vehicle, Julian? Webb asked. No, sir. I have never in my life had anything like that in my possession. Did you know the bag was in that console? No, sir. I still do not know how it got there. Holt's cross-examination was brief and surgical. She established that Julian had no way to prove who put the bag there. She reminded the jury that lab results did not lie. She sat down. Judge Park looked at the clock. We'll take a 15-minute recess and then proceed to closing arguments. The gavel came down. Julian walked back to the defense table. He sat down next to Marcus Webb, who was gathering papers, and Julian stared at the surface of the table and did not say anything for a long moment. Then Prosecutor Holt walked past the defense table on her way to get water from the credenza along the wall, and she paused for just a moment, and without looking at Julian, she said, very quietly, "You should think about taking the plea. 18 months, and this is all over." Julian looked up at her. She walked away. He looked at his grandmother through the low railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court. Constance Banks gave him the same nod she had given him his whole life. The one that meant, "You know who you are." When the recess ended and the room filled back in, Julian was still sitting at the defense table, his hands folded again, his eyes straight ahead. Officer Vance had come back in and was leaning against the wall near the prosecution table with his arms crossed, chewing the same toothpick. And he looked at Julian with the particular expression of a man counting down to something he was certain of. Closing arguments began. Holt went first, calm and methodical, laying out her evidence like tiles in a floor. When she finished and Webb began his closing, Vance shifted against the wall and looked at his watch. And then Webb said something in his closing that was legally sound but delivered with more heat than he had managed all trial. Something about a young man's future being dismantled for the benefit of people who had never once considered what that future might have meant, and Vance laughed. It was a short sound, a breath of contempt, barely audible, but Julian heard it. Julian's head turned. Vance met his eyes, and Vance smiled. Something in Julian Banks broke open. Not his courage, not his dignity. Something smaller, something more human, a 17-year-old's absolute limit after months of this machine grinding against him. "You're a criminal," Julian said. The room went still. Judge Park's head came up from his notes. "Mr. Banks." "You planted that bag," Julian said, louder now, his voice cracking on the edges. "Everybody in this room knows it. You're a criminal wearing a badge. Mr. Banks, you will be silent or I will hold you in contempt." But Julian was standing now, and Marcus Webb was grabbing his arm, and Vance had pushed off the wall, and the thing that happened next happened so fast that several people in the gallery did not fully process it until it was already over. Vance crossed the floor in 4 steps. He moved with the brute impulse of a man who had never once suffered a consequence for his impulses, who had in 15 years developed an absolute certainty that he could do anything in this county and be fine. His hand came up and connected with the side of Julian's face with a crack that echoed off the high ceilings of the courtroom, off the slowly spinning fans, off the portraits of former judges watching from the walls. The room erupted. The gallery was on its feet. Constance Banks made a sound that was not a word. Marcus Webb was between Julian and Vance in an instant. The bailiff stood frozen in the corner, looking from Vance to the judge and back again. Judge Park said, "Order." And then, after a moment, more quietly, "Officer Vance, please return to your position." Vance fixed his collar, walked back to his wall, picked up the toothpick from where it had fallen and put it back in his mouth. Julian sat down. His cheek was red. He did not raise his hand to touch it. He looked straight ahead at nothing at all. In the front row, Constance Banks had both hands pressed flat against her Bible, and her lips had stopped moving. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. They did not open the way courtroom doors usually open, pushed by someone careful of the noise they might make, someone conscious of the proceeding in progress. They opened with a controlled violence, swinging back on their hinges and striking the interior walls with a sound like 2 gunshots, and everyone in the room turned. The man who walked through wore a charcoal suit of the kind that is not purchased at a department store, the kind of suit that costs more than Derek Vance made in 3 months. It was immaculate despite the heat. He moved down the center aisle of the courtroom with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who had never in his life needed to hurry because the world stopped and waited when he arrived. He was 6'2". He was lean in the way that suggests not a gym but a life of sustained purpose. His face was composed into something that was not quite an expression at all, a stillness that was somehow more unsettling than anger. He wore sunglasses, dark lenses that reflected back the dingy courtroom light, and he did not remove them until he reached the gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court. Then he took them off. His eyes were the color of deep water, and they burned with a terrifying icy calm, the kind of calm that is not the absence of fire, but is fire compressed to its most concentrated point. He looked at Julian first. The look lasted less than a second, but something in it communicated volumes. Then those eyes moved to Derek Vance. Vance stopped chewing. "Who are you?" Judge Park said. His voice had taken on a querulous, uncertain quality. "Sir, this court is in session. You cannot simply..." The man reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal jacket and produced a badge. He held it up with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times, the gold catching the light, the seal reading clearly even from the back of the room. "Blaze Banks," he said. His voice was quiet, absolutely quiet, in the way that very still water is quiet, and the room leaned toward it without meaning to. Assistant Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption and Civil Rights Division. A silence fell in the courtroom that had a texture to it, thick and pressing. "I am the senior law enforcement officer present in this room," Blaze Banks continued, his voice never rising above a conversational level. "And I have just witnessed a sworn officer of the law commit a federal civil rights violation in direct view of this bench." He paused. Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. That is a federal felony. He looked at the bailiff in the corner. "You will place Officer Derek Vance in handcuffs, now." The bailiff looked at Judge Park. Park said, "Now just a moment. You cannot walk into this courtroom and Judge Park." Blaze turned his gaze to the bench, and the quiet in his voice did not change, but something in it tightened. "In approximately 22 minutes, federal agents will arrive at this courthouse. In approximately 45 minutes, a federal grand jury subpoena will be served on the records office of Oak Creek County regarding case number 47729 and 8 related matters. I am giving you the opportunity to demonstrate your cooperation with a federal investigation at this early stage, which is an opportunity I would recommend you take." He looked back at the bailiff. "Officer Vance, handcuffs now." Vance straightened. He had lost the toothpick somewhere. His face had done something complicated in the past 60 seconds, moving through arrogance into confusion into something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. "You got to be joking me," he said. "I have not made a joke in a professional setting in 11 years, Blaze said. "You can't do this." "I have the full backing of Derek Allen Vance," Blaze said, his voice dropping to something barely above a murmur that carried to every corner of the room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." He nodded at the bailiff. "Either you put those cuffs on him, or I charge you as an accessory after the fact. Your choice. You have 5 seconds. The bailiff looked at Vance, looked at the gold badge, looked at Judge Park, who had gone the color of old newspaper. He walked to Vance. Vance put his wrists together with the slow, stunned movement of a man for whom the architecture of the world has just shifted without warning. A man who has built every structure of his life on a particular understanding of how things work and has just watched that foundation crack. The sound of the handcuffs was metallic and precise in the silent room. Click. Click. Constance Banks exhaled. In the front row of the gallery, a woman next to her began to cry. It was the kind of crying that comes not from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming release of something that has been held too tight for too long. Julian Banks sat at the defense table and did not move. He watched his father walk past the gate and into the well of the court without expression. Blaze Banks looked at his son, and for just a moment the composed stillness of his face shifted, a microscopic softening around the eyes there and gone. Then he looked at Judge Park. "Your Honor," he said, "I would recommend a recess." Park looked out at the courtroom, at the gallery on its feet, at Vance in handcuffs, at his own hands resting on his bench. He brought the gavel down. "Court is in recess." They set up in a conference room on the second floor of the courthouse. FBI techs had arrived within 20 minutes of Blaze's entrance, 3 of them in identical black jackets carrying cases of equipment. Moving through the courthouse hallways with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this in 100 similar buildings in 100 similar towns. The lead tech, a woman named Reyes, sat at the table with a laptop open and a portable forensic recovery unit connected to a hard drive that had been pulled from the Oak Creek PD system. Blaze stood behind her with his arms crossed, watching the screen. "Walk me through it," he said. So the body cam footage for the Vance stop was marked as corrupted and deleted from the system 11 days after the arrest. That's standard procedure when it's listed as technical failure, but deleted doesn't mean gone. Her fingers moved on the keyboard. Fragments of the original file were still in the unallocated space of the server. I've been reconstructing it for the past 72 hours. How much did you get back? Enough. She hit a key. The footage that appeared on the screen was grainy in the way of recovered files. Slightly degraded, but clear enough. The timestamp read September 14th. The location was Elm and Prospect. The camera angle showed the passenger side of a stopped vehicle, a street light overhead, and Derek Vance's profile. In the footage, Vance leaned into the passenger window of the car. His body blocked the camera's view of the interior for several seconds. When he straightened back up, his right hand was empty, moving to rest on his belt. Then he opened the passenger door and reached inside. When he straightened up again, he was holding a small plastic bag. He looked directly at the body cam, apparently forgetting for a moment that it was running, and he said, with the amused ease of a man talking to no one in particular, "Easy." Then he looked down at the bag in his hand and said, still to himself, still with that loose, practiced ease, "Sorry, kid. Just business." Blaze Banks stood behind the tech and watched this for the full 43 seconds that the recovered footage lasted. Then he said, "Get me everything from his phone records for the past 6 months. Focus on communications with Chief Higgins and anyone in the county administrative office." Reyes nodded, already pulled. She navigated to another window. This is a text exchange between Vance and Chief Martin Higgins, dated 3 weeks before the Banks arrest. Blaze leaned in. The text chain was 14 messages. Most were logistics, scheduling, reference to other stops and other names. But near the bottom of the chain, sent from Vance's number to Higgins at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, was a message that read, "Got another quota filler. Easy target. Grandmother's got the Meridian property. Boss will be happy." And Higgins's reply sent 4 minutes later, "Good. Keep it clean. Let the system do the rest." Blaze straightened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where is Vance?" "Room 4. We've had him in there for an hour." "Good." He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and he walked to room 4. Vance was sitting at the table in the small room with his wrists still cuffed in front of him. Someone had given him a bottle of water that he had not opened. He looked up when Blaze came in, and the look on his face was the complicated combination of a man who has had an hour to let the reality of his situation settle, and who has used that hour to construct arguments for why everything is going to be fine. Arguments that are increasingly difficult to maintain. Blaze sat down in the chair across from the table. He turned it around first, straddling it backward, his arms resting across the top. He put his cold coffee down. He looked at Vance for a long moment without speaking. Vance said, "I want a lawyer." "You'll have one. That's your right. But before your lawyer arrives, I want to tell you something. And you don't have to say a word in response. You can just listen." Blaze paused. "We have the body cam footage. The recovered footage from the night you stopped my son." The blood left Vance's face in a single visible recession. "We have the text chain between you and Chief Higgins. We have financial records showing payments from an LLC called Oakview Holdings to a personal account you opened in January of last year under your mother's maiden name." Blaze's voice remained at its same quiet, level register. It had not changed in pitch or volume since he walked into the courthouse. "What you are looking at right now, Derek, without any additional charges, is federal civil rights violation, evidence planting, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. That's 20 years minimum. Federal time, no parole." Vance's jaw worked. "But here is where you have a decision to make," Blaze continued. "The people who put you up to this, the people who designed this system and used you to run it, they are currently operating under the assumption that you are the end of the line, that you take the weight and they walk away. They have done this before. You are not the first officer they have used this way." He tilted his head slightly. "The question you need to ask yourself is whether you are willing to spend 20 years in a federal correctional facility for people who, right now, are not thinking about you at all." A long silence. Vance looked at his uncapped water bottle. Then he said, "Sterling Heights." Blaze did not move. Go on. The condo development. Sterling Heights. The mayor. Mayor Anthony Sterling. Mayor Anthony Sterling. He had a plan for the Meridian Street corridor, 8 blocks of it. Buy it up cheap, rezone it, build luxury condos. The problem was holdouts, people who wouldn't sell. Vance stopped. Swallowed. Constance Banks was the biggest one. She's been there since before half those other houses were built. She wouldn't sell to anybody for any price. She said that house was going to her grandchildren. He paused. So Sterling came to Higgins, and Higgins came to me, and the plan was, you make the family desperate enough, you create enough legal pressure, you give them a reason to need money fast, and they'll sell. And Julian was that reason. He was the target, yes, and the judge. Judge Park. What's his role? Vance was quiet for a moment. Then, Park is a partner. He has an equity stake in Oakview Holdings. He was never going to let that case go any way but guilty. Blaze stood up. He picked up his coffee. He looked at Vance for a moment. Your lawyer is going to be here in about 20 minutes, he said. I'd recommend you tell them everything you just told me. He walked to the door. Hey, Vance said. Blaze stopped. Is your son okay? Blaze turned to look at him. Just looked. For 5 full seconds. Then he walked out without answering. The call from the deputy director came at 7:17 that evening. Blaze was in his rental car in the courthouse parking lot, the windows down, the heat of the day finally beginning to ease toward something tolerable. He looked at the name on the screen for a moment before he answered. Blaze. The deputy director's voice was measured and careful. You know why I'm calling? Yes, sir. The subject of this investigation is your mother. Your son is the complaining witness and was the target of the underlying crime. You have a personal connection to every material party in this case. You know I have no choice. I know. I'm pulling you off as lead. I'm sending Whitmore in to take over the federal investigation. Everything you developed today, the recovered footage, the text chain, the financial records, you hand that over to Whitmore and you step back. A long pause. Blaze, I need to hear you say you understand. I understand, sir. And I need to hear you say you're going to step back. Another pause. Shorter. I'll step back from the federal investigation. The deputy director was quiet for a moment. Be careful with that wording, Blaze. Good night, sir. He ended the call. He sat in the parking lot for a long time. The last of the evening light turned the courthouse facade the color of old brass. He watched a mockingbird on top of a light post go through 4 different songs without pause, running through everything it knew. Then he drove to Meridian Street. His mother's kitchen smelled the way it had always smelled. Coffee and cinnamon and something deeper underneath. The specific smell of a house that has been loved inconsistently over many decades. Constance Banks had changed out of her church clothes and was at the stove, and she did not turn around when Blaze came in, just said, "Sit down, there's food." He sat at the kitchen table, the table where he had done his homework, the table where she had made him practice his handwriting and memorize the Bill of Rights and explain back to her everything he had learned in school each day, because she believed that you did not own knowledge until you could teach it. He set his badge on the table between them. Constance Banks turned from the stove. She looked at the badge. She looked at her son. She set a plate in front of him and sat down across from him. They pulled you off, she said. It was not a question. Conflict of interest. She nodded slowly. So what now? Now I am a private citizen having dinner at his mother's house. She looked at him for a long moment with the same eyes she had given him, deep and still and very clear. What does a private citizen know about real estate fraud? Not much, he said, but a private citizen can talk to people, can listen to what the neighborhood knows. He picked up his fork. You know better than I do. People in this neighborhood, they see things. Bank tellers, they notice patterns. Kids on bikes, they go everywhere. Constance Banks was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Marcus Webb's cousin works at First Continental. She's been watching a lot of transfers in and out of an account connected to a company she'd never heard of before about 18 months ago. What company? Oakview Holdings. Blaze set down his fork, looked at his mother. I know, she said. I'm not just a grandmother. Over the next 2 days, working from his mother's kitchen table and then from a rented space above a dry goods store on Meridian Street, Blaze Banks built a network of information that had no official status and no law enforcement backing, and was more thorough than half the investigative work he had seen done by full federal task forces. Marcus Webb's cousin at First Continental documented 18 months of transfers through Oakview Holdings to 3 personal accounts, each transfer small enough to avoid automatic reporting thresholds, the classic structuring pattern of people who are careful but not quite careful enough. The total across all transactions was $4.3 million. A teenager named Deshawn, who delivered groceries on a bike, and who had been delivering to the City Hall area for 2 years, had seen things he hadn't thought to tell anyone because no one had asked. He had seen Mayor Sterling's car at the Meridian Street site after hours. He had seen a man he identified from a photo as Chief Higgins meeting with a man in a hard hat at the corner of the proposed development 3 times in the past 6 months. He had seen a surveying crew working the Banks property line at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, a crew that had been there and gone before Constance Banks woke up. A woman who worked the reception desk at Oak Creek County Administration had noticed that all the zoning variance applications for the Meridian Corridor had been approved in under a week, at a time when standard variance applications were taking 4 months. She had thought it was strange. She had not thought it was her place to say so. When Blaze sat across from her at a coffee shop and listened to her for 45 minutes without interrupting, she said she had been waiting for someone to ask. 3 partners. Oakview Holdings, the shell through which all the money moved. Mayor Anthony Sterling holding a 40% stake. Chief Martin Higgins at 30%. And Judge Reginald Park, who had presided over Julian Banks's trial with a financial interest in its outcome, holding the remaining 30%. Blaze Banks took everything to Whitmore. He did not explain how he had obtained it. He presented it as information developed from community interviews by a private citizen and left Whitmore to determine what to do with it. Whitmore had been in the Bureau for 23 years. He looked at the package of documents for a long time. Then he said, I'm going to need to ask you some questions about your methodology. I'm available anytime, Blaze said. You understand that if any of this was obtained in a manner that every person I spoke to came to me voluntarily, every document I have is either public record or was provided to me by someone with lawful access to it. I am a private citizen who went around and talked to people. Whitmore looked at him. I went around and talked to people, Blaze said again. Whitmore picked up his phone and called someone. The warrant was filed the following afternoon. The Sterling Heights groundbreaking gala was held on a Friday evening at the site of the proposed development on the Meridian Corridor, 3 blocks from Constance Banks's house. There were lights strung between temporary poles, and there were round tables with white linens, and there was a bar serving wine, and a catered spread in a string quartet near the back of the space. There were large LED screens set up around the perimeter showing renderings of what Sterling Heights was going to look like when it was finished. Glass towers and manicured walkways and rooftop pools, a vision of the future for people who could afford the future. Mayor Anthony Sterling was at the podium in a blue suit and a flag pin, working through the opening remarks he had prepared with the particular ease of a man who believes on a cellular level that the world is arranged for his benefit. What we are building here, he said, his voice amplified and warm, is not just a development. It is a statement. It is Oak Creek County saying that we are ready for the next chapter, that we believe in progress. In the crowd, people in cocktail attire held their wine glasses and nodded. Sterling paused for effect. He looked out at the lights, at the tables, at the dirt of the construction site which had been raked smooth for the occasion, at the screens showing the gleaming CGI future. The screens went dark. A murmur moved through the crowd. Sterling looked over his shoulder. Someone near the tech station was saying something into a radio. Then the screens came back on. What they showed was not a condo rendering. It was a room. Fluorescent lighting. A table and 2 chairs. And Derek Vance, sitting across from a camera that he apparently did not know was recording, speaking in the flat. exhausted voice of a man who has decided that cooperation is the only remaining option available to him. Sterling had a plan for the Meridian Street corridor. Vance said on the screens. Buy it up cheap, rezone it, build luxury condos. The problem was holdouts. The crowd was completely still. The string quartet had stopped. Constance Banks was the biggest one. She wouldn't sell to anybody for any price. Sterling moved away from the podium. He moved toward the tech station, and his face had gone from the warm amber of the event lighting to something gray and fixed. So Sterling came to Higgins, and Higgins came to me, and the plan was, you make the family desperate enough. You create enough legal pressure. You give them a reason to need money fast, and they'll sell. Sterling was past the tech station now, moving toward the perimeter of the event, moving toward the parking area, moving faster. 2 of his aides fell in beside him. His security detail moved with him. They were 10 feet from the parking area. A figure stepped out of the shadow at the edge of the lights. Blaze Banks was not wearing his badge. He was wearing a dark jacket over a gray shirt, and he was holding a document in his right hand. And he stepped into the light with the same unhurried deliberateness he had walked into the courtroom with 4 days before. He was flanked, 8 feet back on either side, by Agent Whitmore and 6 federal officers in raid jackets. Sterling stopped. He looked at Blaze. He looked at the federal agents. He looked back at the screens where Vance was still talking. Anthony James Sterling, Blaze said, his quiet voice carrying perfectly in the sudden stillness of the event space. I have here a federal warrant for your arrest on charges including conspiracy, racketeering under the RICO statute, fraud, civil rights conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Sterling looked at the warrant. His eyes moved across it. His face arranged itself into something he clearly meant to look like outrage, the expression of a man wrongly accused, but the architecture of it was wrong. The timing was off, and it looked like what it was. This is absurd, Sterling said. I am the mayor of this, you were, Blaze said. Sterling took a step backward. His heel caught in the raked dirt of the construction site, the very dirt of the Meridian corridor that he had spent 18 months conspiring to steal, and he went backward and sideways and down with a graceless sprawl, one hand grabbing at nothing, the blue suit jacket spreading around him in the dirt. The federal agents were on him in a moment, calm and efficient. Sterling was on the ground of the site, in the dirt. The actual dirt. Blaze Banks stood over him with the warrant still in his hand, and looked down for a moment with those still, burning eyes. Then he turned and walked away. The sentencing hearing for Mayor Anthony Sterling, Chief Martin Higgins, Judge Reginald Park, and Officer Derek Vance was held 6 months later in federal court. The courtroom was cool and modern, and the air conditioning worked perfectly. A different judge presided. The Honorable Alistair Thorne, who had been on the federal bench for 11 years, and who had the reputation of a man who read every page of every document he was given and remembered all of it. Sterling's attorney made the arguments that attorneys in his position always make. Community ties, first offense, the complexity of the case, the possibility of cooperation. Judge Thorne listened to all of it with the attentive patience of a man with time. Then he looked at Sterling over his glasses and he said, "The crime for which you stand convicted is not a crime of impulse or desperation. You deliberately constructed a system to deny an elderly woman her home and a young man his future in order to profit. You used public office, law enforcement authority, and judicial power as personal instruments of fraud. The court finds no mitigating circumstances sufficient to reduce the mandatory sentencing guidelines." He looked down at his papers. Anthony James Sterling, 30 years. Federal Correctional Facility, without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down. In the gallery, a woman who had lived on Meridian Street for 40 years began to cry. She was not the only one. 3 weeks later, Blaze Banks sat at his mother's kitchen table. The late afternoon light came through the window the same way it always had, falling at the same angle across the same worn surface. The badge he had set on this table the night he was pulled off the case was back in his jacket pocket. But it was a different badge now. Same gold, same seal, different title. Special Agent in Charge, Oak Creek County Field Office, Anti-Corruption Division, newly established. Permanent. Julian Banks sat across from him. His cheek had healed completely. He was in his own clothes, a t-shirt and jeans that fit him, and he looked like what he was, a 17-year-old kid who had been through something that no 17-year-old should have to go through, and who had come out the other side of it knowing things about himself that it usually takes much longer to learn. Constance Banks set a dish on the table between them. Peach cobbler, still warm from the oven, the crust golden, the syrup dark and fragrant. Julian looked at his father. His father looked at him. Constance sat down at the table she had sat at for 50 years and picked up her fork. "You should eat it while it's warm," she said. They ate. After a while, Julian said, "So what happens now?" Blaze looked at his son across the kitchen table. In the kitchen he had grown up in the house that was still standing on Meridian Street because his mother had refused to let it go. "Now," he said, "we make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Julian nodded slowly. "That sounds like the beginning of something." "It is," Blaze said. He looked at his mother. He looked at his son. He looked at the cobbler on the table and the light through the window and the street outside where the neighborhood was still there, still standing. "But I didn't come here to start a war," he said. He picked up his fork. "I came to end one."